Is the old system of international relations now over? And if so, what comes next? Hello and welcome. My name is James Ker-Lindsay, and here I take an informed look at international relations, conflict and security. So, our first question comes from It Is William. Are we in a new age of impunity, or can the old rules-based order be re-established? So, thanks so much for a really, really brilliant question, because this is something I think that anyone who's watched the channel for any amount of time will know that this is something that I've been really worried about, that I think that we've seen a gradual deterioration in that old rules-based order in recent years. And while I have hoped that maybe we could manage it, that and deal with it and prevent it, even roll it back, I'm increasingly asking myself whether that's the case. And I think that what we've just seen in Iran is very much a part and parcel of a general sense that the old order has been cast to one side. Now, I've made my views clear on what I think we've seen there. I'm not willing to see it as black and white as some people are. But what I can say for certain is that I think that the United States' decision to attack, while, as I say, it would argue that it was taking on Iran's nuclear capabilities, I think by any reading of the rules of aggression, that was an illegal attack. And I think this comes on top of so much else that we've been seeing in international relations, not just in the past few years, but this is something that goes back over 20 years. I think, we all look to what Russia's done in Ukraine. It's been absolutely appalling, and that it has really driven a coach and horses through established principles of international law. But I think that if we are to be realistic and to be fair and to take a full rounded picture of what we've seen, is that this order has been gradually collapsing for the past 20 years, if not slightly longer. In fact, we can say for the past 25 years, that there's been a steady number of incidents that have worn it down. Now, some of those might have been done for the best of reasons. So, for example, Kosovo in 1999 is a very obvious example. This was when NATO decided to get involved. It saw what was happening in Kosovo. It saw the Serbian attacks there. It couldn't go through the Security Council. Russia had blocked it, so it decided to act anyway. Now, I remember very well when the debates on that was taking place, and there was a real sense of, well, this isn't legal, but it's legitimate. And I think, this was something that a principle that emerged at this time. It was very much tied in with the idea of responsibility to protect, which, for anyone who might not know, this was a big sort of, if you like, innovation that occurred after 1999 and at the start of the turn of the millennium, where the international community said the old idea of sovereignty could not be used by states in all circumstances to justify human rights abuses, and there were times when the principle of sovereignty would need to be cast to one side in order to do the right thing where there was egregious human rights abuses. The problem with all of this was, although this was sort of widely accepted, it did open the door for then countries to make the argument, well, we're getting involved in this situation because we believe that there is a human rights abuse that's taking place, and we need to act. And that, it's generally accepted now that the principle of sovereignty doesn't matter. And I think that did enormous damage in actually opening the way for other countries, and often acting very much out of self-interest, to claim that human rights abuse is taking place in a neighbouring state, or in a state where there were it had a kin ethnic group, so a group that they would say was closely related to them, that was being attacked, that their human rights were being affected, so they had the right to step in. And I think that we've seen that was very, very clearly the case, that it was Russia's use in the case of Ukraine. But I think we've also seen it in a number of other cases. But of course, you had the Iraq War as well in 2003, which a lot of people have been drawing parallels with what we're seeing in Iran at the moment, that claims that, there was weapons of mass destruction. This was never proven. In actual fact, after the US intervention, after the US invasion of Iraq, that they never found those weapons of mass destruction. They weren't there. And I think that this has all contributed to what we've seen, but it has definitely been speeding up in recent years in a way that is incredibly worrying. And it's not just what we've seen in Russia, Ukraine. As I say, it has also been the fact that Trump has been so willing, so open about questioning the borders of not just potential enemies, but also countries which are seen as friendly allies. So, for example, talking about taking over Greenland, which is, under the rule of Denmark, which is a NATO partner of the United States. So I think that this is all incredibly worrying. But we've also seen it sort of breaking down in other places. So, for example, we've seen the way that Venezuela has openly challenged Guyana's borders. We saw that how Rwanda intervened in Democratic Republic of Congo. Although in a good news story that looks like a peace agreement has been reached. How deep it goes and how long-lasting it'll be will be something else that we have to see. But nevertheless, what we have seen is a gradual breakdown of a lot of these rules. And I have long been thinking about how do you stop this, or more importantly, how do you reverse it? And I'm really starting to worry now that we might well be at a point where it's impossible to reverse it. That we're just seeing so many examples and so many countries feeling that they can rewrite those rules. And the trouble is that with every country that does that, you have other countries that say, well, why can they get away with it? Why should they have the right to get away with it if no one's going to act? And the thing about international law is that, the international system, it works differently from domestic law. In domestic law, you do something wrong, you commit a crime, you have a police that can come along and arrest you. International law works very, very differently from that. You don't have a sovereign, you don't have an overarching sovereign authority. Each state is sovereign. So there's an ability via the Security Council, for example, for countries to act against those rule breakers. But a lot of time, the rules are followed because states want to uphold international law. But just like in real life, even if you get people who are generally speaking law-abiding, that if they start to see that others are systematically breaking the rules, then they start to say, well, why are we following them? Why are we trying to do this? And so I think that this is an incredibly dangerous time. And that, as I say, a lot of those rules are being broken. You hear it online a lot. You have this that, people sort of saying, oh, there is no such thing as international law. No, that's absolutely not true. There is something called international law, and it has actually held up remarkably well on the whole. But it is now breaking down, and it's been replaced by something which says that might is right, that big powers can do as they want. So what you're now starting to see is that rolling down, that sort of other countries are now starting to say, well, look, maybe we should be doing this. So I think it's an incredibly dangerous time. And I think the point you said, are we entering an age of impunity? I think that's exactly the risk that we see. Now, how do we reverse that? I just don't know how we reverse it. I don't know what we can do apart from some countries starting to try and make the case that we need to return to a rules-based order. But it's going to be difficult to do that when you have large countries such as the United States, such as Russia, not following that order. I think Europe potentially has an ability to do that. But again, even in Europe's case, there is a lot of people who will claim that it's all hypocritical, that Europe has, it's bent the rules when it suits itself. There's also the fact that in parts of the world that Europe is seen as sort of either colonial, post-colonial, neo-colonial, but there is that colonial legacy that means that if Europe just comes along and says, well, do as we tell you, that there is a pushback on that. Europe has really got to live by those rules itself, and it doesn't always do a particularly good job of doing it, but it needs to be able to talk to other parts of the world. I've long said that I think Africa is a potential partner in this. I think Africa has a lot to lose by this by a watering down of international law, that there is a lot of potentially contested borders in Africa. I think African states don't want to see this breakdown, and I think that Europe could be a very good partner to say to the Africans, look, we really do need to try and sort of maintain international law, but a lot has got to be done to address accusations of hypocrisy. It's very, very important, and I think that there is a real legacy that Europe hasn't always followed the rules that it so clearly champions. So I think there's a lot that needs to be done, but it's actually got to be started by Europe sort of being very clear and having a very clear policy in itself of what has gone wrong, how it intends to fix it. But I think that the big problem is that when you've got the really big actors in international relations that aren't following those rules, then it becomes very, very difficult to enforce them and to get other countries on side to that. So JK Reb 57 asks, will the removal of the veto from the United Nations Security Council make the UN more relevant and capable of solving global issues? This is a really, really interesting question. It's one that I gave a lot of thought to because, of course, there is this argument that, well, if you remove the power of the Permanent Five to have this veto, then that will be fair. It will be a better United Nations. And more I think about it, less sure I am of that. And I think that's for several reasons. Now, look, I think the starting point has got to be, look, we know that you've got the permanent 5 members of the Security Council that were essentially the victors of the Second World War, a war that finished 80 years ago, the better part of a century, that they have had this power in international affairs. And many would say that, this is absolutely outrageous. All right, you've got Russia, you've got the United States, China, but what is Britain doing there? What is France doing there? Why isn't India there? Why isn't Brazil there? Why isn't South Africa there? Why isn't Nigeria there? We can hear all those arguments. So, and I've spoken about Security Council reform before and how you might be able to bring in some of those countries maybe on a semi-permanent basis. But the idea of getting rid of that veto power, I'm not sure that it really does represent the best way forward. Now, it's absolutely open to abuse, and we have seen that. We have seen the way that Russia used its veto to block any condemnation in the Security Council of its invasion of Ukraine. We have seen, for example, that had there been any effort to try and condemn the United States bombing of Iran, then Washington would have used its veto in the Security Council to prevent that. We've seen how, for example, the United States has often blocked Security Council resolutions which have been very critical of Israel. We've seen how Russia has used its Security Council veto in order to support friends and allies and effectively use it as a diplomatic tool to increase its power in the world stage. It can say to countries, listen, if you're friends with us, we'll block resolutions against you. So it is definitely open to abuse. What worries me is that if you get rid of it, and I'm perfectly open to, hearing other alternative views on this, but this is a sense that I have, that if you get rid of it, then you're making it even less likely that countries such as the United States and Russia will actually pay any attention at all to the UN Security Council. At the moment, you've got a situation where what you're saying to them is that they can express their displeasure with something that's going on in the world. So even if the rest of the world is very much in favor of a course of action, you're acknowledging that China, Russia, United States can say, we disagree, and that our view is sufficiently strong that it stops this from going ahead. Now, again, that can be seen as a tool of abuse, but it's also a very, very powerful tool of buy-in for these countries. I just worry that if you remove that, so for example, then you get a situation, for example, where the international community condemns Israel, and the United States at the moment says, right, okay, we don't accept that, we're vetoing the resolution, and then everyone says, well, this is an absolute shame, this is it's terrible. But they go on with their things, and the United States says, right, we've used our veto, fine. If you get to a situation where that's taken away, and then what you do, or what worries me, is that you incentivize countries to take even less notice of the United Nations. So at that point, the United States says, we absolutely fundamentally reject this. The resolution has gone forward, condemning Israel, or, in the case of Russia, condemning one of its allies. It just simply says, well, this all just proves to us the United Nations is irrelevant. We're not going to follow that resolution. And we get back to the point that I made in the previous question, that once some countries start to systematically say they're not going to follow UN resolutions because they feel they weren't right, then you're opening the way for others to follow. And I think that one of the great advantages of the UN Security Council system as it's been structured, and it has its flaws, is that we still have thousands of resolutions that have been passed which represent the settled will of the great powers. That we see this even now on a regular basis, that UN Security Council resolutions are passed, and the fact that they have the support of the United States, of Russia, China, Britain and France says that this can be taken as essentially the word of the international community. Now, I know there'll be a lot of people in Africa and Asia who say this is outrageous. Maybe, but this is exactly how it works. If you can get Russia and the United States and China to all agree on something, especially in the current international environment, then that gives that statement from the UN a lot of significance, if you like. And I think the danger is if you take away that veto, then in fact you make that less so. So while I can definitely see an argument for doing this, and it would seem from a justice argument, from a sense of political equality, that it would be a good thing to take away the veto, I think just in terms of real political implications for it, that it could actually do far more harm than good. I hope you're finding this useful. If so, please consider giving it a like, and perhaps subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thanks so much, and now on to the next question. Neddlechater 442 asks, why is the credibility of such a highly respected and accredited institution as the ICC not being respected regarding their current warrants? So this really ties in with the previous two questions, and I think this is why, in this Q&A video, I really wanted to focus on these issues, because I think this is all part and parcel of a general weakening of international law that we're seeing at the moment. So you've raised the question of the International Criminal Court. Now, for viewers who might not be aware, the International Criminal Court is a relatively recent development in international relations that was set up after the criminal tribunals for former Yugoslavia, for Sierra Leone, to try political leaders and military leaders for the very worst examples of human rights abuses, for genocide, for ethnic cleansing. And it was seen as a hugely important step forward. And while it has been incredibly significant, I think it's also important to note that some countries, in fact, a number of countries, have refused to accept it. They don't accept the Rome Statute, which set it up. The United States is a very, very obvious example of a country that refuses to accept the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. Russia doesn't either. Israel doesn't. You have a number of countries that do this. But balanced against that, there are a lot of countries that have signed up to it, that say, yes, we do accept the jurisdiction of the ICC and we will adhere to it. Now, what we've seen is that there have been a number of cases that have been brought against leaders from Africa and Asia. And that was all very well, and it was very important, but many felt that this was small fry. These were the small fish. They weren't the really big actors that were committing war crimes. And what we've actually seen is that there has been more and more of a move to take on those bigger actors. So it's all very well saying, right, okay, let's go after, a political leader from a relatively small African country. That's not to minimize for one moment what they were doing. But that's rather different from what we're seeing at the moment, which is now the ICC has been issuing indictments against Vladimir Putin, for example. It's issued indictments against Benjamin Netanyahu. And at that point, what we're now starting to see is that then it becomes a lot more difficult to enforce those warrants on several levels. So what we're seeing is that there are some countries that just don't want to get into the difficulties of trying to arrest a leader, but they want to maintain their political and diplomatic relations with the country concerned. So the country I'm thinking of, for example, is Mongolia. So after Vladimir Putin has been issued with the ICC warrant, that, you know, he hasn't been able to travel to many countries which are part of the Rome Statute, but he did go to Mongolia, and Mongolia is a signatory to it, and yet didn't arrest him. And I think that, you know, there are those who are sort of saying, well, this was outrageous. But one can also see that when you're in a very difficult geopolitical situation, as Mongolia is, squeezed between Russia and China, and obviously having looked for a long time towards the Russians, that to arrest Vladimir Putin was just absolutely, that just wasn't going to happen. And so I think you do have this problem that you then have that sense of impunity by leaders, that in certain cases they can act. I think the other problem starts to come in is that then you have a sense that this is politicized, that what they're doing is going after certain leaders, and leaders who have quite a lot of support for one reason or another. And so what we've seen exactly is with Netanyahu, is the Americans have been absolutely clear. We don't care what the ICC says. It's irrelevant to us. And Netanyahu been welcomed to the United States. And many people have been angry about that and said that this is double standards. And to come back to my original point that I made in the first question, is that this all feeds this sense of impunity that all helps to break down international law. Because once countries start to say very obviously, we're not going to, you know, enforce ICC arrest warrants for whatever reason, or these are illegitimate warrants. And in fact, it's worth noting that the United States was so angry about the one against Netanyahu that it's actually sanctioned members of the court, you know, which is a very, very serious development in its own right. It's not just saying we don't believe that this has validity. It's saying we believe that this is politically motivated and we think that this is an outrageous abuse of power by the ICC. And so we're going to go against we're going to go after officers of the court. And I think that this is a very, very dangerous development in all sorts of ways. But it does, again, contribute to it. So I think that what you then see is that countries in Africa and Asia say, oh, well, that's obviously, we understand how it works now. You're happy to come against Africans and Asians, but you're not going to go against Europeans or Westerners or, you know, sort of Russians or Chinese. You know, they can carry out things as they want because they're the big powers. But of course, you know, when it means coming after, you know, an African leader, well, yeah, that's absolutely fine. So that all helps to delegitimize things like the ICC. This is delegitimizing, you know, other institutions as well. And this is all part and parcel of the bigger problem that we're seeing. So I think this is a really great question. And you raise yet another element in the bigger picture that I think is extremely troubling. So Mirabeau851 asks, what keeps you a liberal internationalist and not falling into a more pessimistic view of realism? Mirabeau, thank you so much for this question, because this is obviously something that, you know, I do think a lot about. I'm really, really worried about a lot of the things that I'm seeing happening. I think that we are seeing a move to authoritarianism, but I'm also sort of really, really concerned about, you know, just this sort of populist nationalism that's emerging, that pushes back against liberal democracy and treats liberal democracy as though it's this just absolutely terrible thing. You know, the sooner that it's got rid of, the better and everything. And I don't really understand that mindset. I think that it's very much about, you know, democracy is about giving people a chance to have a say in how their lives are run. And it just seems to me the most natural thing in the world. Why wouldn't you want people to have that right? And tied to that, this idea of liberal democracy, where you recognize that within society there are people who are different. We can accept those differences. We can tolerate that difference. We can support that difference. And I think that, you know, when I look around and I have seen, you know, how, for example, women have been discriminated against, the disabled have been discriminated against, the elderly have been discriminated against, people from ethnic minorities have been discriminated against, people with minority religious views, why would nobody want to actually live in a society where people can actually, that difference can be accepted, respected, and supported? It just strikes me as the most natural and normal thing in the world. And so in that sense, I think part of the thing that keeps me that liberal internationalist is because I believe in it, and I see it under attack, but I still think that it's important. Now, people could just simply say, well, that's naive, and maybe, but, I think it's important that we still continue to push for it, because I think that's the sort of society that I certainly want to live in, and I would like to think that most people watching this would want to live in. Now, that's not to say that you're going to agree across the board. You might have your own strongly held views on something, but you can tolerate that difference and allow it to exist. And I think that, my sense is that a world that would be built on liberal democracy is a world where it's far less likely you're going to see conflict. You're far less likely to see nationalism. And I think that this is why, as I say, it's not just about an optimistic nature. And I have to say that by nature, I am optimistic. I was having a very interesting chat with a friend of mine the other day about this and about nature. Some of us in this world are more optimistic and some are more pessimistic. I think, and we were having a really fascinating discussion about whether you're born innately optimistic or pessimistic, or whether it's social factors that change you. Please drop your comments below. I'd be interested to hear that. And my sense is that I've always been much more optimistic about things, and I like to think that that's helped me get through difficult points in life that we all go through and things like that. And so I think it sort of helps. So it's two things. I'd say ultimately it's my own sense that liberal internationalism, the idea of cooperating with each other, is a good thing. But it's also, I guess, my innate optimism that, I like to see the positive side of people. I like to see the positive side of the world. And I think that we can actually get to a world where we can reduce conflict, that we can reduce inequality, that we can reduce poverty, we can help people develop, that we can treat those who are less fortunate than ourselves. I think this is just fundamentally where I come from, that, I think we can deal with conflict and try and resolve it. That doesn't mean I'm some sort of naive pacifist, far from it. I do believe that armed force needs to be used on occasion, but I also understand that, as I say, I think fundamentally the international community is served much more effectively when we pursue, liberal democracy and liberal internationalism. No One That Matters 44 asks, what is your critique of John Mearsheimer? How is he viewed in professional IR circles, and what does he get right? So look, thanks a lot for this, and I know where this is coming from. So some of you who were watching the live stream at the weekend will have seen me criticise Mearsheimer, and in fact, I think it's tied up very much with the answer I just gave in the previous question, that by nature I am a liberal internationalist, and Mearsheimer stands absolutely opposed to that. So for anyone who doesn't know, Mearsheimer is considered to be the leading thinker of a school that's called offensive realism. And essentially realism in international relations is the idea that the fundamental unit is a state, and those states will act within an anarchic system of international relations. Now, when we use the term anarchic, we don't mean anarchy in the sense of sort of, how it's used in a popular level. I mean, it means, it comes from Greek, it means without authority. And so in that sense, it comes back to the point I made. We don't actually have an overarching sovereign in international relations. It's not like a domestic situation. Each state is sovereign. And so Mearsheimer's view is that each state is sovereign, but not each state is equal in its power. And what you do is you have certain countries which are the major hegemons within that system, and they will be out to increase their power. And I think that I have several criticisms of Mearsheimer's view. I think partly that I don't believe that that is the case. I don't believe that all powerful countries are just out to constantly increase their own power at the expense of others. I think we can see lots of examples where countries work in a more cooperative level, that we see countries that are willing to give up a degree of that sovereignty, of that power, to work with one another. I think that, for example, the European Union is a very good example of this, where countries have recognised that it's actually more beneficial to work with each other. I think that, the argument that he's made about the United States, and that what has happened is the United States has exerted its power to have a hegemonic relationship, hegemonic control over Europe. I don't think that's particularly accurate. I think there are elements of it that are accurate, and I've talked about it. I think, for example, the recent debate about the United States wanting to increase power, cut the spending in Europe and have Europe spend more on its defence, I think was counterproductive, because in many ways Europe had become, if you like, a protectorate of the United States. But it's not as simple as Mearsheimer would make out, because the European Union is an incredibly important economic actor, and with the relationship with the United States, United States is not the hegemon economically over Europe. In many ways, I'd argue it's the other way round, that Europe now sets the standards for many areas in international trade, that we have. And I often talk about this, what we call the Brussels effect, which means that, Europe now sets the standards, for example, on producing electrical goods. And because Europe is such an important economic actor, other countries just fall into line and say, right, okay, we'll adopt those standards as well. And I think that again shows that, it's not as simple as it's made out. And that has only been able to happen in Europe because countries have been willing to pool their sovereignty and work with each other. I also think, there's two other points that I find very, very troubling about his views. One is there's a lack of morality. He doesn't believe in morality. It's a very amoral view of the world, and you can tell from my previous answer, and maybe sort of looking at how I've addressed things, that's not where I come from. I believe in a better world. I believe that we should be working to try and enforce international law, that I believe that countries should be cooperating with each other. We all benefit from that cooperation. And his view doesn't really have a basis on we should be trying to encourage countries to cooperate. He just takes a view, his view is that his outlook is that it's all about power, and that countries don't have to cooperate in that way, and they won't cooperate in that way, and they shouldn't cooperate in that way. They will just exist to strengthen themselves. And I think my final, but perhaps most important, and this is where I think he's done a lot of harm, is that he has pushed this idea that the United States and NATO, this has just been a continuation of that offensive realism of powers wanting to increase their strength, their dominance in the international system. And so any expansion of NATO must be seen in those terms. And he has become, if not an apologist for Russian behavior in Ukraine, but certainly the person that those who want to support Russia's invasion of Ukraine will hold up to say, this is the person who shows that Russia was right, that Russia's argument that it's all about NATO expansion, and that this is about the West trying to exert its hegemony over, Eastern Europe. And of course, Russia is right to see this as an extension of a dangerous extension of European and, Western American power into Europe. And so it had a right to respond. And I think that is wrong on so many levels. One, it comes back again to this view of morality and amorality. I think it's wrong because it misunderstands exactly how NATO is structured and what NATO does, and the complex relationship between United States and Europe at a political, at an economic level. I think it also fundamentally discounts the element of soft power that comes into all of this, that ultimately Russia does not have much soft power, whereas the West has a large amount of soft power. The countries that want to join NATO don't just want to join NATO because it's a military alliance. They want to join NATO because it represents a club of successful, liberal, democratic, open economies, that there is a model that it represents, that those countries want to align themselves, and they don't want to align to the Russian model. And I've heard people say this, from countries which are generally thought to be more pro-Russian, but they've even said that they don't. Russia doesn't actually offer a lot to them, certainly in that soft power element, and I remember very clearly once, an official from one country turning around to me and said, listen, we're quite happy to have Russians come and buy property in our country, but we don't want Russian shops here. What Russian products can you think of that we would possibly want? And that's a really, really interesting example of that soft power, that lack of soft power. And I think that NATO very much represents an arm of a more general sense of the West that countries want to join up to. So the idea that, NATO expansion is something that's driven by the United States as a relentless attempt to pursue hegemonic control just doesn't tally with the reality as I see it. And so I think that these are all the reasons why personally I push back against Mearsheimer's views, but also I think that the way that it has been manipulated, and he hasn't tried to push back on it, for the justification for the war in Ukraine, I think has meant that a lot of people have I don't think people were particularly supportive of his views in the first place. I mean, there is a body of school of thought that does sign up to it. I don't happen to, in terms of international relations. I accept there were those. But also at the same time, I think a lot of people now have questioned what he's saying. And you can really pick it apart and say, look, this is wrong. I mean, it's not just wrong in terms of an empirical sense that it's wrong. I think that, people feel that it's wrong because it's been used and manipulated to make very, very troubling arguments. Unfortunately, that's all I have time for in this video. Thanks so much to everyone who submitted a question. If you want to submit one in future, please do keep an eye on the community tab. I post calls over there at the end of each month. In the meantime, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you in the next video.